Welcome. Just to note that I have increased the size of my scale and layout resolution for the purposes of this video so that you can see things very clearly on the screen. Today we're going to be looking at buttons in the package Hyperbole, and to know about that package all you need to do is go to the GNU.org website, and there you will find information all about Hyperbole, how it works and what it's about. Hyperbole offers the wonderful ability to create buttons in any buffer or in files of any kind that allow you to quickly navigate to places or to execute actions. This here is a button. This little bit of text between inverted commas. And the button, of course, is a metaphor. And when I first started to hear about buttons, I wondered in what sense the word buttons was being used. Now, there are different ways that we can use the word button. We can use the word button for that little item on our shirts or jackets. Then there are these little critters, the button spiders. This, of course, is the sense in which we mean button when we talk about buttons in Hyperbole. It's something that when you click on it, you launch something like a rocket. And that is the metaphor that I'd like you to stick with as we proceed through this demo. Now, there are two main types of buttons in Hyperbole: implicit buttons and explicit buttons. Implicit and explicit buttons can also be used globally, in which case they are called global buttons. And such buttons are located in this file here. And that is our global button file. And we can also access our global button file by going to the menu and clicking Ctrl H, B, P. Or a simpler way to do it is to simply turn it into a button. And we are there in our button file. And the lovely thing about global buttons is that they can be accessed anywhere from within Emacs, not only from the button file, not only from a particular file or buffer. So for instance, let's say we wanted to activate this button, WF, which is my daily folder. I would go Ctrl H, G, A, and we would be in the folder of our choice. You can access these global buttons from anywhere within Emacs. But let's get to implicit buttons. Implicit buttons are text patterns recognized by the context. Let me give you some concrete examples. The first and most basic example of an implicit button is a URL. And you simply activate the URL by pressing Alt-Enter, and it will open that URL for you. Now, I know what you'll say to me. You'll say to me, well, this is already a link within this org file, and all I need to do is click on it, and the link will open. And you're absolutely correct. Where Hyperbole scores is that you can create these links in any file, not just in an org file, and in any buffer, not just in an org mode buffer. So for example, if we were to copy this URL here to the clipboard and go into the Scratch buffer and paste this URL, you could activate it simply by invoking Alt-Enter. And that's really wonderful. So that is a simple example of an implicit URL button. You can also, of course, add a name to a URL button, as I have done in this case with Google Calendar, and I can activate it either using my keyboard or using my mouse. Let's use the mouse in this instance, and we go directly to Google Calendar. Let me show you how you can name an implicit button. Let's take this link to the Hyperbole man page, and let's give it a label. Control H, H-I-L, let's name it hyperbole man, and there it is. And the nice thing about these URLs is that you can add the hash to mark sections within them, and this hash works also with markdown and org files as well. So you can mark a path and add the hash, and it will take you to a particular heading within that markdown or org file. Let me give you a couple of examples of file path implicit buttons. These are buttons which allow you to access a particular file or a file path, and they are very specific in that you can even add the line number and the column number, as I have done in this case. And just to note that section links can also precede the line column numbers. Another great feature of hyperbole is that it understands relative paths. So for instance, this particular file, which is in my .emacs.d directory, I don't even have to type out the full path. I can just type in the name of the file and it will take me directly there. And the same here with the files subdirectory in my home folder. So any variable that exists in your Emacs or shell environment will work there as well. Another example of the implicit button type is the key series. One can construct a series of keys, as one normally does in Emacs, to create a key series. And these are simply the same regular keystrokes that you would perform in order to do any action within Emacs. So for instance, if you wanted to access the scratch buffer, you would type Control X, B, select scratch, press ret. But there's a simpler way, and that's simply to type it out in your buffer like this and click on it, and you are in the scratch buffer. Here's another example. I frequently access my org-roam find file command, and I look for files with the tag Emacs. So you can see here that for repetitive tasks, this is absolutely wonderful. Let me give you another example. I frequently go into my customize user interface, and the action key, just to note, also activates any highlighted Emacs push buttons like those in the customization buffer as well. Here's a nice example which will allow me to perform a Google search. Let's search for hyperbole, and there we have it. And just to note that key series buttons are not limited to single key bindings. Some are more like keyboard macros that do a series of things. And here's a more complex example of a key series. Another example, one can access one's bookmarks, and so on. The only limit is one's own limited knowledge of Emacs. The greater your knowledge of Emacs, the more that you can do with these implicit buttons in hyperbole. And one can also simply create a simple email by clicking on this link, and your default email program will open up for you. Then we come to action buttons. Now you'll notice that action buttons are marked by less than and greater than signs. These action buttons turn Emacs function calls or variables into buttons. They are a generalized type of implicit buttons. And let me just give you a couple of examples. One thing that I frequently do is turn off and on my menu bar mode. So let me turn it off, and keep your eye on the menu at the top. Now let me turn it on. Let me turn on the toolbar mode, and let me turn it off. I like to use Hyperbole with Emacs Diary. I did a very brief video where I showed some of the things that you can do, but one of the things that I do frequently is access my diary this way. And to give you a very different kind of example, you can play your games. One can also use Hyperbole to go to one's GitHub repository and even to a particular commit. Special features are built in for Git users. Okay, so those are some examples of implicit buttons. Let's look briefly at explicit buttons. Just to note that explicit and implicit buttons use the same set of action types, so they can do similar things, but you have greater control over what you do with explicit buttons, whereas the context of an implicit button, including its own text, determines what action it will perform. When you're not creating single line buttons, you can create explicit buttons which embed in the text, and they are better to look at than implicit buttons. So let's say, for instance, that you're typing a document and you want to reference various things in that document. You wouldn't like the full path of the file or the full path of the URL. You would like simply a name, which if you were to click on it would take you to that hyperlink. And these explicit buttons can be created easily using the interactive menu. And the particular command is Control H, E for ebut, and C for create. A simpler way, of course, would simply be to click on this button. Now let me just give you two examples of buttons that do the same thing, but they look different. At the top in red is an explicit button, and you'll notice that the particular information about this explicit button is hidden. Underneath is an implicit button which does exactly the same thing. Both of these buttons take me to this file notes and to the first line of that file. Similarly, in the second example, the red button Gmail takes me to my Gmail, and underneath is an implicit button which does the same thing. You can notice the aesthetic difference between these two kinds of buttons. And if you want to show the metadata of an explicit button, you would do so by invoking Control H, capital A. The other advantage of explicit buttons is that they provide greater control for creating links to specific places. So let me give you a lovely example of that. I've created this file called testheadings.org, and we're going to go into that file by invoking Alt-Enter. And let's go down here to this last heading that we've got here, heading 4, and to this subheading, this heading here. Now I'm going to create an explicit button to that heading. And let's do that over here. We're going to go Control C0. We're going to go here, Control C0. Let's give it a label, heading. And there you have it. Very, very quick, very, very helpful. And of course it applies also when the file is closed. Now just to note that what I've just showed you, you cannot do in org mode, because to jump to a heading like this in an org mode file, one would need to be in an org file. Whereas with Hyperbole, it doesn't matter what kind of file one is in. Now, org users may argue that there is org minor mode, which allows you to use org links buttons outside of org mode. But you have to follow org's link syntax, which lacks the visual flexibility that Hyperbole has to blend your buttons into text naturally. Plus, it is not a global minor mode, so it is not automatically enabled everywhere. And so you can't just activate buttons wherever you like. Also, links in org mode are not easy to do, but with Hyperbole they are made with ease. And the wonderful thing is with Hyperbole is that I can create links now in all my files, regardless of the type. Now all of this leads to the creation of a central location from where one can conceivably do everything. When you realize the power of implicit and explicit buttons, you're led to the creation of a hub. Now a hub is a place from where you can launch all of your activity, a place where you can navigate your files, browse the web, and execute actions. And this leads us all to the global button file. This global button file can store both implicit and explicit buttons, and you can use it as a central location from which you can do all of your activity. And in order to access one's personal global file, one would simply need to type Control H, H, B, P. So let's go into that now. And you will see here the file that I started with in the first video that I did. And from this place, I can do all sorts of things. I can write emails, I can check different pages in the web, I can go to my GitHub, my bookmarks, my files, my folders, I can check my schedule. The sky's the limit to what a person can do. So basically, from this central button file, you can have your global hub from which you can launch all of your activity. And the wonderful thing about all the information in this global file is that it's global and can be accessed not only from the file itself, but in fact from anywhere within Emacs. So let's set to launch.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, lift off.